Welcome back. In this video, we will talk about responsive layouts in Flutter. Now, I'm not going to say I am a total expert on responsive layouts because it depends on the specific app you're creating, what type of direction you will take in order to have a responsive layout. So there's a lot of packages out there that can help you also with responsive layouts, and I will go through some of the basics of how to build responsive layouts. Okay, so what I've done with this specific application was just to create a new application. I have my app that returns a material app, which the home is a main page, which is a stateful widget, where I've got a scaffold, an app bar that says responsive layouts, as you can see there. And in the body, I've got a list view.builder. So it just builds a list view for me. There's 20 items in it. You can see there's the 20 items from person 1 up until 19. Or person 0 to 19, so maybe just add the index there plus 1. Just going to add there a plus 1, so we start at person number 1. So if I save again, we will have person 1 up until person 20, so there's 20 items in the list. And then what do we return in the item builder? I'm returning a list tile, so these are list tiles where I have a leading widget as a person widget, the trailing one as waves, and the title changes depending on the index. And there I've got my 20 different person list tiles. Right, so let's look at the following. Let's say I'm taking my phone and this list view looks quite fine. I don't have a problem with it here. Maybe we could have added a bit more data in it to make it a bit fuller. But as soon as I put the phone on its side in landscape mode, you can see that the phone adjusts. And now the space there between the person 2 and maybe the list tiles trailing icon there becomes a bit too big. And maybe when the phone is in landscape mode, you do not want to have this. Maybe you want to have a different layout shown than the one that you have normally with the phone in portrait mode. So in portrait mode, this makes sense because we can have a list that uses up most of the space. But as soon as I go to landscape mode in the phone, I will see that there's a lot of space wasted here. Okay, so in order to do this, we could do the following. So what I'm going to do is to take this list view.builder and I'm going to place it in its own, or replace it as its own widget. So I'm going to use extract widget there, and I'm going to call this one list data. Okay, so list data will then be extracted and we have it here. I'm going to copy this class, list data, and I'm going to recreate something else there. And let's call this one grid data. So I'm going to change it there also. Must be grid data there. And instead of having a list view there that we're going to return, let's do something else. I haven't touched on this yet, so you can maybe go and have a look at the grid view also. So I'm going to use a grid view, and I'm going to use the named constructor called count. And this helps me with the cross-axis count. So the cross-axis count is how many items do you want, or how many columns basically do you want. And let's use 2 for now. And then that will be the one I return, will be just a grid view. So what is the values that I want to return for this grid view? So we will have some children there. And the children must be a list. So I'm going to generate this list using list.generate. And you can see I need to have the length. So I'm going to keep it the same as we did with the item count there. So the length will still be 20. And then I need to do something. So it's basically doing the same as what we did for the list builder there. But I need to return something back. So again, I'm going to return this same list style. So I'm going to return that part. Paste it there. And save it. And this is now my grid view. So the grid view count is 2. So there's 2 columns. The children will generate 20 children for me using the index. And it's the same index there that I'm using again. So instead of using list data here, I can now use grid data. And if I save, it looks like this. Okay. Not very nice at this stage. So what we can also change in the grid view is to go and set the child aspect ratio. So let's set that to a 4 and we save again, and now it looks a bit better. Okay, so if you look at your layout now, this makes a bit more sense than going to the normal list style. But if I switch back my phone again, then I get this type of layout, which is not nice. So you can see that maybe for portrait, we can use the list view or the list data. And for landscape, we should maybe use grid data. Okay, so we can go and have a look at the different options that we have in order to make our layout responsive. So one way now to look at this is to use the media query. So the media query needs some type of context here. So I'll add it here at the top and say double width equals. Now I'm going to use the media query class. So I'm just going to be media query. Do not want to use the whole constructor there. So it's the media query class dot of, and it needs a context. So we've got this built context now. And if I put the dot there, you will see there's a lot of options that's available to me. For example, I can see the orientation of the device currently by using this media query. So if I need to have the width of the screen, for example, I can go with the normal size property there. And if I go into size, I can see the aspect ratio, I can see the height, and I can see the width, for example. So I'm going to go with the width here. And what this width now will say for me is, in fact, the screen's width. Now, I can do the same. I can also go with the height of the screen. And to get the height, I will again say media query dot of context dot size, and now just go and get the height. So if you wanted to do something with the height and the width of the screen, you can directly use the media query. And what it will return is the exact height from the top of the screen, so where my cursor is at now, until the bottom of the screen. So it's at the top of your notification bar even, right at the top up until the bottom. That's the height. The width is from the end of the screen or from the left of the screen to the right of the screen. So for example, one way how we can display this now correctly, so we can say if the width is greater than 600, then we will have the grid data displayed. Otherwise, we will have the list data displayed. Now, if I add my comma there at the end and I save now, you will see now for this layout, we see the list. Turning the phone on its side will still give me the list. Let's make it 500 there and look at it, and there you can see. So if the width is greater than, normally we would go with a mobile device for something like 480. If it's bigger than 480, then we know it's maybe a bigger screen. Okay, so the width, if the width is more than 480, we can show the grid data. Otherwise, we can show the list data. So if I go back to portrait now, you can see we see the list. If I go back to landscape, we see the grid. So this is one way of maybe making a responsive layout. So another way of doing this is also to go and have a look at the orientation. So let's look at the orientation quickly. So we can go and say double orientation equals. Now we can go to media query again, and I'm going to use this same. Getting tired of typing that whole thing out. It's just popping up the constructor for me the whole time. So we can go then after media query.of, and then we will see the orientation. But now the orientation is not a double, so if you hover over it, you can see it's an orientation. So I'm going to have that as orientation. Okay, so we've got the orientation there now. So now what we can do, instead of having this part there, we can now check the orientation. So I can say if the orientation is equal to orientation dot, and you can see there's landscape or portrait. If it is portrait, then we can display the list data. Otherwise, we can display the grid data. And by saving it now, we should still see the same result. So I can now go to portrait back again, and we should see the portrait layout. So I'm just going to rerun this quickly. Okay, so now if you look at your list, the orientation is currently portrait, so it's showing the list. If I put it on its side, it will now be landscape, and you can see it's showing the grid data. Okay, so now let's look at one other option that we also have. I'm going to remove the orientation here, And let's look at something we call a layout builder. So we're going to use a layout builder. That's the layout builder class. Put a comma at the end. And for a layout builder, you will see that it requires a builder. So we're going to use builder there. Keep your cursor there and make sure that you take the context with the constraints. And now this layout builder needs to return back something that it needs to build. But now what we can do is we can have some if statements in here to also decide what we want to return back to build. For example, we can go and have a look at the constraints. And this constraints now is a lot the same as what we returned back from the media query. So we've got some constraints, for example, like the max width that we have available on the screen, the max height that we have available on the screen, and so forth. Now, there is a slight difference between this layout builder's constraints and the values that we get back from the media query. So the media query will always send back the width of the screen, which means it's from this side until that side. The height is from the top, even the top of the notification bar, until the bottom of the screen. So that will give you those exact values always. Now, for the constraints of the layout builder, it will give you the available space of the parent of this layout builder. Which means in our case, the parent of this layout builder is the scaffold. And because the scaffold is basically the whole screen, we know that if I look, for example, at the width, it will be the same as the width of the media query. But something interesting now, because my scaffold has got an abar, then the available space that the layout builder will have is only the body of the scaffold. And the body means it's from the bottom of your abar until the bottom of the screen. And that will be different now than the height that we get from the media query. So just be reminded that the constraints of your layout builder gives you the available space it's got in the parent widget. So let me quickly demonstrate that for you. So I'm going to just return back a list data for now. And we will look at some options that we can have later on. So if I save now, we should just see the list, which is correct. Now let's print out some interesting values here. So I'm going to use a print statement here. And let's say we print out the media query first. So I'm going to use the media query, and you see the width value there at the top. So I'm just going to use that width value. Now inside of this builder, I want to also print out that constraint. So I'm going to use here, let's say builder. And let's print out that value of constraints dot. And you can see there's a lot of constraints here. So if you go down, you can see there's the max height and the max width. So the max height just means it's the maximum amount of height that it's got available. Okay, so we're comparing apples with something else here now. So let's compare apples with apples. So it's going to be constraints dot max width. So we compare the width against the max width. So the max width here means the maximum amount of space in the width that it's got available to set out its children in the layout builder. In this case, the maximum amount of width to set out this, or to set up this list data. So let's run this quickly and save it. And you will have a look at this and you'll see that media gives me exactly the same width as builder. And that makes sense because we are inside of the same body, and from left to right, there's nothing that's different between what the media query will give us and what the layout builder will give us, because the layout builder's parent is still the scaffold, and the scaffold consumes everything from the left to the right of the screen. Now, one thing that is interesting, let's say I go to this layout builder now, and I will add, let's say, some padding around it, which means now the parent now for the layout builder is in fact the padding. Now, the padding has got the entire scaffold to work with, but it will deduct some padding. Okay, so let's have a padding of, let's say, a 10 there, and we save it, just to see the difference now nicely. So you can see now in the width now, the width of the screen still stays the same. It's still 384. But for the builder, you can see now it's 10 from the sides. So 10 from this side plus 10 from that side gives me 20, and that's why there is a 20 difference, which means now this layout builder has got less space now to work with in order to lay out list data on the screen. Now the exact same thing, I can remove this padding now. Let's remove the widget again. And instead of having the width displayed here, I'm going to use the height. And instead of max width, I will use max height. Okay, so let's look at those two quickly. If I run it now, you can see the media query's height is 592. So that is the screen from the top, from the notification bar, right down to the bottom is 592. Whereas the builder gives 512. And why is that? Why is the difference there now? Because I do not have any padding. And the difference comes in with your app bar. So if I comment out the app bar now and I save again, you will see that the height for both media query as well as the layout builder has got exactly the same space to work with. Okay, so if I place back my app bar again and I save again, you will see your layout builder, the constraints now picks up that you only have space to work with from the bottom of your app bar until the bottom of the screen. So now again, inside of this layout builder, we can go and play around with some of these constraint values in order to decide what we will be returning. So for example, we can start off by saying if this constraints dot max width is greater than 800, or let's make it 400 for now, 500, then we want to return the grid data. Else, we want to return list data. Let's just remove this return statement at the bottom and let's save again. So now again, you can see that it's fine. It's showing the list. If I go to portrait, if I go to landscape, you can see it changes again. So now you can also use the constraints, but now remember that this max width now looks at the parent of the layout builder in order to decide what is the max width and the max height. So just keep that in mind as well. But at this stage, it seems as if everything is still working the same as what we used for the orientation. So it's really up to you which method you want to use to make your layout responsive. So maybe because we will mostly be using either a phone or a tablet, you will most probably just go with the orientation. But the layout builder, just remember that the layout builder, inside of the layout builder, you can also use the orientation properties. So you can use orientation inside of here, but still use these constraints with the max width and the max height in order to lay out different components. Okay, so a place where you can really start seeing the magic of this is actually when you're going to the web. So let's just go quickly to Chrome and we run this on Chrome quickly. I'm going to stop it from running on the virtual device and let's run it on Chrome. Right, so here you can see my Chrome browser opened up with this exact same application running, and I'm going to resize it to the smallest possible value. And you can see that it resized, it automatically responded with a different layout when it went smaller. So you can see, for example, running this now on a mobile phone, if you had this as a web server somewhere or web app somewhere running, you will see that this will actually display something similar on the phone. But when you resize for desktop or for web, you can see that it is resizing the layout, so it's being responsive. But now you can see the aspect ratio of that grid is now getting bigger and bigger. So you can actually go and put in different breakpoints. So for example, one breakpoint that we have here is the 500, which means that when I go bigger than 500 in width, you will see that the layout responded with the grid layout. Okay, so let's add some other breakpoints in here. But first, let's see if we can change this grid data a bit. So you can see that we have an aspect ratio there. So I think I'm going to pass in an aspect ratio here. So if I hover over that, it's just a double. So we use a double aspect ratio, and we're going to use it as a required here. So we need to have the aspect ratio. Let me just correct the spelling. So it's aspect ratio, and then it will have a problem because we need to make that final. Okay, and then we're going to use the aspect ratio there. So we're going to use aspect ratio there. And if we save and we go to the top, let's set some breakpoints here. So for example, we can maybe add 1200 there. So if it gets to a maximum width of 1200, then we return the grid data with an aspect ratio. Let's make that one 8. And we'll see the changes now. But if, let me just add another else if there, else if the constraints dot max width is, let's say, greater than 800, then we will return grid data with an aspect ratio of, let's say, 4. And then everything smaller than 800, we will have list data, for example. So if I save this now and I go back to my web, okay, so you can see it's a list view. It's a list still. It's a list still because it needs to get quite big in order to get to the first breakpoint. So there's the breakpoint. And you can see now it is making the list bigger and bigger and bigger until it will get to the next breakpoint, and then it will readjust that aspect ratio, which will take the grid back. And you can see there's the breakpoint. So we were at that stage, and there we hit 1200 in width, and then it refreshes the aspect ratio, and that's another breakpoint again. So it depends. So let's say you're on a desktop or something, and it looks like this, or you're on a laptop, or not on a laptop, on a tablet, and maybe it goes to this width. There's different breakpoints that you can then set and have different layouts shown for different breakpoints. Okay, so that is the basics of building responsive layouts in Flutter. So it is very important that you do not test your app only on one mobile device, and it's only locked in portrait mode. Do a lot of tests with different screen sizes in both portrait and landscape. And most of the time, people that's downloading your app from the Play Store or let's say from the iOS store will do so also maybe with a tablet. So also use the tablet to test on and make sure that your layouts actually look correct there as well. Do not only stay at portrait mode or only stay at a phone. Make sure you check out all of the rest also. So maybe a good practice can also be, if you have to make your app responsive, avoid maybe using the media query of context to calculate spaces and dimensions. It holds a lot of metadata about the physical screen, but it knows nothing about the parent widget in which it needs to lay out the data. So you're going to use the layout builder to make responsive layouts, as it provides dimensions about the containing widget. In this case, it's the scaffold, and not about the screen itself, like the media query does. Again, it depends on your specific app that you are developing and what you want to do with that app. So these are just a few of the concepts that you need to know in order to create responsive layouts. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. See you in the next one.